Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the Director of Communications at the Writers Center. I'm also an author, so that's why I will be sort of emceeing today. But before I come back and ask some questions, I do want to introduce a special introducer of our special guest today. Mark Simrot is joining us. He is a board member at the Writers Center and was our past board chair as well. And maybe most importantly, he was also the author of the book Squeezing Silver. And I believe I tossed that link into our link document to share as well. So please check out Mark's book as well. And Mark, I'll hand off to you to introduce Ann. And Ann, I'll talk to you in a little bit.
So thank you, Zach. So Ann Hagedorn is the author of Sleeper Agent, The Atomic Spy in America Who Got Away. Simon & Schuster is the publisher. So I first met Ann around 1987 or 88. She was at the Wall Street Journal. She was covering a case where I was trying a case. And I actually wasn't supposed to be talking to her because the judge had gagged me, but that's another story. But in any case, we continued to stay in contact after that and became friends. And I have this image in around 1990 or the early 90s where we're walking through, I think it must be Lower East Side in New York, probably because I was at court again for another case. And we're talking, and then she says to me, you know, I'm leaving the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to become an author. And I was flabbergasted. I mean, how do you leave a job like the Wall Street Journal for one, but then how do you support yourself, Ann? How do you pick a subject? How do you write a book? I mean, all of this went through my head. Well, she's now on her 7th book, I believe, and they're fascinating subjects. Wild Ride, The Rise and Tragic Fall of Calumet Farms. Ransom, The Untold Story of International Kidnapping. Beyond the River, which is about the Underground Railroad going through Ripley, Ohio, where she's from. Savage Peace, about the United States right after World War I. The Invisible Soldier, which is a fascinating story about how we outsource our security. And now this book. I got to tell you, my wife and I devoured this book. We read it, I don't know, in a day or two, or she's much quicker reader than I am. I just, she's going to tell you about it, so I'm not going to interfere with that. I mean, I just had so many questions after reading it. I mean, how did she know about George Koval? How did she research it? How did she do the structure? In any case, I'm going to turn it over to Ann because I hope she's going to tell us all about that and other things about this book. So Ann, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It's great to be at the Writers Center again, and quite an honor. And my plan, as Zach and Mark have noted, is that first I'm going to talk about the writing process a bit, specifically story structure, and that will be a good segue into Sleeper Agent, followed by 2 brief readings that will also be a segue into what I told you about story structure and the book. And then Zach will have questions, and we'll have questions from the audience. But to begin, in general, the genre of narrative nonfiction is about using literary techniques to tell true stories. I consider it my job as a writer to seek the truth and to pick topics significant to the American public, and then using the facts unearthed from thorough research and reporting to engage readers through the art of storytelling. And I dare say it's more than a job for me, and that could be explain our conversation many years ago, Mark. It's a bit of a calling, and our audience here, I'm sure, is filled with writers, and we all know that once we start the writing process and whatever topic we've chosen, feels that way. We're driven by it. So it is like a calling. My quest is always to find the compelling narrative that will bring alive for the reader all issues and individuals at the core of the book's topic. And among the criteria, I'm always asked, how do you pick your topics? Because they're so different. The topics, I mean, I learned this working at the Wall Street Journal, of course. The topics must have significance, possibly in danger of falling through the cracks of history. They must have literary potential, and we'll get to that a little later. They must be doable research-wise, of course. They must have general reader appeal. That pleases my agent, of course, the market. And what also pleases my agent, because she's this wonderful person who is very passionate about the work of her clients, I must choose a topic that rouses my writerly passions. So first choose the topic, then find the best narrative to bring it alive for the reader, right? That's the usual sequence. Though this time, I must confess, I discovered a remarkable story first. And that happened with Wild Ride and Beyond the River, stories that grabbed me from the start. And this one, you know, of course, became Sleeper Agent. I could spend a good deal of time tonight talking about the writing of Sleeper Agent and the research. It's been quite an adventure. But today I'm going to go quickly zero in on the one part of that process, the part that is so crucial for all writers of narrative nonfiction to hone, and that is story structure. And as I said before, that'll be a good segue to Sleeper Agent. But first, story structure. Let me lay the foundation here. Story structure is what I call the core of the art of nonfiction writing. After all, art is about selection, right? Selecting in, selecting out. And story structure is about the selection of details from your research, your reporting, what to include, what to exclude, what to put before and after what, right? Such structure is paramount to achieving literary art because the art in all parts of a piece of writing exists purely in the arrangement of words, sentences, paragraphs, chapters. It's about the order of the facts, the descriptions, the quotes. Very basic, yet very, very profound. It's the part the reader doesn't even notice, right? The hidden struts and braces beneath the hull. And I see it as a great mix of discipline and creativity, because sketching out the story structure provides guidelines, not outlines, guidelines that allow the release of the creativity of the writing, usually with good results. Story structure translates the passion into form. It's about the music or the cadence of the content of your story. I first tuned into the art of story structure at the Wall Street Journal because of my first editor there, Don Moffat, with whom I've been in contact lately. He's read Sleeper Agent, likes it very much, and a great guy, great editor. And he was very into story structure. I think he wanted the reporters in his group to think through each story very thoroughly, to analyze its components and choose a structure that was best to capture the topic instead of using any formulaic methods. And he was so into it that he assigned one of us, one of the writers in our group, to do a front page story on a guy named Robert McKee. I don't know who in the audience might know about Robert McKee. He wrote a book called Story. One point, at that point, he was traveling the nation doing writing workshops for screenwriters. And the assignment, from our group, went to Ellen Graham, and Ellen invited, I think, two of us to go with us. It was a weekend of studying story structure. So, and there's Robert McKee, I just noted a few minutes before the program started, that in his book Story, he has a quote about story structure being a symphonic unity in which all stories have to be a symphonic unity in which the structure seamlessly melds setting, character, and theme. And his quote, "To find the harmony, the writer must study the core elements of the story as if they were instruments of an orchestra, first separately and then in concert." So sketching out the story structure is really about finding the best way to present all that you've worked so hard to discover, to unearth. You must deliver it in an accessible, artful, compelling way. And to do that, you must know the components of your story. What absolutely must be included, what is most significant to the themes of the story, what are the most dramatic and intriguing details, the greatest scenes, the most remarkable and startling facts, what is the essential background to bring the main story alive. Remember that what moves you will move the reader. You identify the life-changing moments in the storyline. What is at the heart of the story? What stands out the most? What is it that you shall never forget? For that is what the reader shall never forget most of the time. You can teach yourself how to envision structure by studying the structures of good pieces of writing, actually dissecting them, which is one of the things I learned at that Robert McKee workshop, as I recall. And the same with good movies, good pieces of writing, good movies, you can dissect them. After reading a good book, seeing a good movie, read it again, see it again, and analyze why it works so well. What is the order of things? Articles, books, and cinema, I call those the ABCs of learning story structure. And I'll give you an example with my current book, which is the biography of a World War II spy, Soviet spy. And I'll give you the quick elevator pitch. Everybody knows what an elevator pitch is, right? You're standing in the elevator, the author's standing in the elevator, someone says, "What have you been up to?" And in 60 seconds, you have to explain what the book is about. I've never been very good at it, to tell you the truth. It's easier for me to write a book than write the elevator pitch. But anyhow, here it is. Sleeper Agent is the biography of the only Soviet military trained spy to have full security clearance in America's top secret project to build the first atomic bomb. His name was George Koval, and he was a US Army corporal, born and raised in Iowa, who charmed everyone he met. And blending into American culture, he loved baseball, he was a Yankees fan, and he could reel off the history and stats of every big league pitcher. He played bridge, and he also belonged to a bowling league. He could recite verses from Whitman and Longfellow. All the while, he was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help build their own atomic bomb. And as the subtitle of the book reveals, he was never caught. Like all spy stories, the book gives readers the expected intrigue of some espionage details. The code names, the various cover shops in Manhattan, the apartments in the Bronx where Koval lived, as did his handler, and the handler himself and his suspicious routines. I had quite an adventure finding the addresses and then visiting the premises, even interviewing current owners about the history of the former cover shops in Manhattan, and measuring distances from like one main cover shop on West 23rd Street in Manhattan and the Flatiron Building, where the handler was known to have meetings on the 7th floor. It took 5 to 7 minutes, by the way, from the cover shop to the Flatiron Building. But the book goes beyond that. For the biography delves into the psychology of the spy, showing the hopes, fears, and beliefs that spurred his decisions and accomplishments. Everyone's life must have meaning, and I wanted to unveil the people and events that shaped the meaning in the life of this Soviet spy, to immerse the reader into the historical context in which the spy functioned, to basically deepen the themes and significance of a typical spy story and weave in what I call the human constants, speaking to the human condition. Like the first paragraph of the book, at the start of the prologue, which is sometimes the clues that should have been warnings are lost in a blur, only to be seen in hindsight. Caught in the need to move ahead, most people rush like speeding trains, past the truths and half-truths tucked into the terrain they thought they knew. And so it would be for a man and a woman one evening in 1948 at New York City's Grand Central Palace, each soon to learn the timeless cost of missing clues. Unquote. The narrative reveals the details of Koval's self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths, and thus it depicts the traitor that he was, and yet the reader also gets a glimpse at the side of him working hard as a dedicated scientist and surviving furious waves of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. A dear friend of mine, Nick Clooney, who was an early reader of the book, said it's the only book he's ever read about a life that personifies the Cold War battle of the American dream versus the communist workers' paradise. And one of the scholars, Russian scholars knowledgeable about Koval, wrote to me a few weeks ago saying, quote, George Koval's life journey through the 20th century's American and Russian destinies and his work as an intelligence agent had such an impact on world history that his personality and fate will long be the subject of study in both Russia and the United States, unquote. The book also exposes the backlash of bigotry, the persistence of prejudice in history, basically the human cost of oppression. Though his self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths depicts, as I said, a true traitor to this country, Koval was also the dedicated scientist, he was a resilient survivor of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. He was someone who knew the human costs of oppression. So Sleeper Agent is indeed a biography, and it's based on letters, journals, postcards, news clips, yearbooks, photos, maps, tax records, ship manifests, passports, interviews, even inscriptions in books, and thousands of pages of FBI reports. No trial transcripts, unfortunately, because he was a spy who was never caught. So how to present what is discovered, what is gathered? Now we come to the story structure of a biography like this. As in everyone's life, there is the ribbon of time, the exact beginning, middle, and end of the life of the spy. But following the ribbon of time is not necessarily how you should tell a life story, right? Unless you're writing an encyclopedia entry. Instead, you have to study the ribbon of time for your topic. Where is the most important part of that story? Perhaps 2/3 of the way through the timeline is a turning point in the individual's life. Perhaps at the end of the timeline. For biography, you select a memorable moment, an event in that person's life that will grab the reader and that will be a turning point in the narrative. Then you can begin with it, that scene, that moment, that event, that becomes your prologue or perhaps first chapter, but I believe in prologues, or I like to use them. So you can begin it with a prologue and then go back in time to show why that event happened, work your way up to the time of that event again, and then move the reader beyond the event to show the impact of it. That's just one way of doing a biography, and that's what I did in Sleeper Agent. I have a prologue that introduces the reader to the spy when he realizes he must leave America in 1948. He's in New York City on a date with a woman who has no idea that he's a spy and who has heard only lies about his life and his family. It's a turning point in his timeline because he must leave America. It's crucial. And thus he escapes in the closing paragraphs of the prologue. I read you the first paragraph, and here are the closing paragraphs. Though documents and interviews would someday expose parts of the truth about Koval's escape from America, some questions would never be answered, like what he was thinking as he watched the New York skyline diminish and the ocean's vast expanse draw near. Was he remembering the last time he had left America in May 1932 with his parents and his two brothers on a ship leaving from Pier 54, bound eventually for the Soviet Union? Or the details of his father's stories about being a Russian immigrant and seeing America for the first time in 1910? Did he have the manner of a professional, lacking last-minute hesitations or any sentimentality, as the ship passed by the great statue symbolizing the freedoms of the country that was his birthplace? And did he struggle to push back all thoughts of what and whom he was leaving behind? By November, Koval would be living in the Soviet Union in Moscow with his wife of 12 years. And he would soon reunite with his 65-year-old father and 58-year-old mother and one of his two brothers. What he told them about his past 8 years in America on a quote unquote business trip for Soviet military intelligence is unknown. But one certain fact is that George Koval left the US just in time. And as anyone who knew him would likely say, his timing was always nearly perfect. So that's the end of the prologue, the closing of the prologue. Then come parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is, I've entitled it The Lure, and that's his background, how he ended up in Iowa, and why his family left the United States in 1932 to return to Russia. Part 2 is The Deception, which is about what he did while on his quote unquote business trip in America for Red Army intelligence. That part closes with his escape, picking up where the reader left off at the closing of the prologue. Then we move to part 3, The Hunt, what happened after his escape and his return to the Soviet Union, and the FBI's pursuit of him, etc. And then the epilogue. I'll leave that to all of you because you're gonna read the book. And so I want to explain how the epilogue works. But at any rate, so you have prologue, 3 parts, epilogue. And this is the structure of the biography, beginning with the turning point in the individual's life, right? Okay, so do I have, so that's sort of the end of my story structure mixed with sleeper agent lecture, and I was going to end it with a few readings from the book. So do I have time to do that? Okay. So I wanted to stick with the flow here. Excuse me, no pun intended, taking a little water there. I had an editor at the Wall Street Journal who always said, never fall in love with, that wasn't Don Moffat, this was a different one, never fall in love with your own writing. And he was absolutely right. But there are parts of whatever you write that you kind of like. And I've chosen 2 parts to read to you that are, you know, help with the story structure lecture, and I kind of like them. And so one is the first chapter of part 2, right? The deception. And this is when, after George Koval has, you know, returned with his family in 1932, all kinds of things happen in the 1930s, and he is recruited and becomes a Red Army military intelligence officer. And then he must come back to America. And this, I had a wonderful Russian translator who worked with me, and it took a lot of digging to find out how he returned. So that is the beginning of chapter 5, the beginning of part 2 of the book. And it's the chapter is called Undercover in the Bronx. And it begins, one September night in 1940, somewhere in the East China Sea, mountainous waves were tossing a small cargo ship on which George Koval was en route from Vladivostok, a port in the far southeast corner of the Soviet Union, to San Francisco. Quote, we almost got into the center of a cyclone, he wrote in a letter to his wife. Quote, the rocking was huge and all books and furniture were falling on us as we fell off our beds, unquote. Crossing 4,554 nautical miles, the trip would take more than 3 weeks, adding to Koval's 6-day, 5,772-mile train journey from Moscow to Vladivostok. During the calm days, when the winds were a total delight, Koval wrote that he played chess or dominoes with the ship's captain and read stories to the captain's 9-year-old daughter, who called him Uncle Grisha. Bonding with the captain's family on such a long passage would prove essential when the ship docked in America. Though he carried a fake passport, Koval planned to help unload the cargo and then slip away, possibly to a meeting place in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he would be given whatever was needed for his continuing travels. Because it was a cargo ship, the Customs Patrol at that time didn't process entry papers for crew members returning in a quick turnaround to Vladivostok. Still, U.S. officials conducted a seemingly thorough inspection of the ship, during which Koval hid in a storage bench in the captain's quarters. The English-speaking inspectors asked to see identification documents for the captain and his family, a process that apparently took longer than the little girl could tolerate. And so she looked up at her mother and asked in Russian, will Uncle Grisha have to stay under the couch much longer? The mother smiled, said nothing, and continued to hold her daughter's hand while her husband focused on the officials. The calm response of the mother and father, plus the fact that the inspectors likely knew little, if any, Russian, or were simply paying no attention to a little girl's exchange with her mother, saved the day for the Soviet spy. Soon, Koval was boarding a train to New York City. Then one other little reading, which is the closing chapter of part 2. And is when the structure of the book returns, builds back from 1940 when he returns, what he does in the 8 years when he's a spy, and then, we'll return to the escape. And that chapter begins when after he's demobilized from the US Army, he returns to the Bronx in February of 1946. And this is a quick reading that shows how you come back again. Chapter 13, The Escape. From the point of view of his landlady, George Koval could be best described as an earnest student and a quote unquote true loner. Since his move to Valentine Avenue in the Bronx in 1946, Mrs. Gardner had observed his daily routine of leaving early each morning, returning several hours after dinner, and quietly walking up the 4 flights of stairs to his apartment. She assumed he would spend the rest of the evening doing all that good students do. The fact that he earned his City College of New York degree in 2 years did not surprise her, largely because his studies were the center of his life, from her point of view, that is. To Mrs. Gardner, Koval was a timid, remote man who appeared to be burdened by a sad past. This was likely because, as he told her, he had lost both parents at a very young age and was raised in an orphanage in Cleveland, Ohio. Quote, he supposedly had one aunt who never took much interest in him, unquote, Mrs. Gardner told the FBI later. Quote, and he appeared to be very poorly fixed financially, unquote. However, when away from Valentine Avenue, Koval was no melancholy introvert bordering on poverty. As one of his City College of New York friends would later say, quote, he was very, very popular at school. Everybody liked George, unquote. And because he was older than most of his classmates, he had a moderating influence in virtually all forms of discussion. He also had a reputation for being quite the ladies' man. Okay, that's all I'm gonna read. I think we need to get into questions from Zach and then questions from the audience. And if there's time left, I have another little reading I could do, but I think we should get into questions and that's all. Okay.
Sounds good. So you mentioned Koval's baseball fanaticism, and so I'm going to throw a curveball with my first question because I had something pop into head while you were talking. You mentioned a couple of times that this was a traitor to America, and reading this book, though, you know, I'm rooting for the guy to escape.
Yeah, right.
Because and so this is from an American's perspective, a villain, but this is his biography. So within the biography, he's the hero of his own story, as we all are.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So I wonder if that was something you were aware of, that like were you being more generous with him? Did you have to temper any patriotism to give him fair shake when you were writing about him?
No, and I think that that's one of the keys in the story is that, you know, he blended in so well. Everyone liked him, and that was part of his power. And so you can't, you know, my editor and I had a discussion about this, of course, because I worried about it because, you know, I mean, here's a guy who's, it's just like one of the early blurbers said, you know, basically here's a guy, he graduates from high school at age 15. He's in the National Honor Society. He's the head of the debate team. He's very involved in trying to end poverty. He's, you know, works very, very hard, a dedicated scientist. When he returns to Russia, he believes in communism because he believes it's the only ism that will end world oppression. He didn't kill people, you know, he was yes, he was a sleeper agent, but not like the ones recently depicted where, you know, he's taught to murder people. No, he's taught to blend in and to know, especially as a health physicist at Oak Ridge, he had access to all the plants because he had to check, you know, the radiation levels at all of them. So, I mean, there's fascinating stuff about what he was doing as a spy in this country. And yes, he was a traitor in the sense that he was sending that information to the Soviet Union, but he wasn't someone you could hate, and that's part of his power. Mm-hmm. You know, and you can't make up anything. It's pure fact. And the interviews and, you know, the thousands and thousands of FBI reports. And oh, by the way, I meant to, in the acknowledgements, I thanked Mark Simrot for connecting me with an attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, who taught me the smartest ways to use the Freedom of Information Act and the administrative appeals and this and that to get all these reports. But they were fascinating. There wasn't, and you know, toward the end of the book, as you'll see, one of his colleagues at, I've been in contact with one of his colleagues at Oak Ridge, who's 98 years old. We've had an exchange. And I interviewed him for the book, and you know, he was very fond of George. They dated sisters at Oak Ridge, you know, and there's the highly respected gentleman Arnold Kramish, who reconnected to his friend from Oak Ridge later in their lives, and they had letter exchanges and email exchanges. So, you know, this is not a person that you can hate. And but like I said, that's part of his power. But you have to identify him as a traitor because he was sending you know, information out of this country. you can make the argument that the Soviets were our allies at that point. And you can also make the argument, as many scientists will, that there should have been nuclear parity. Everyone knew that the Soviet Union would have an atomic bomb at some point. What Koval sent just speeded it, it just quickened everything, and that's what the chief scientist later wrote, that 50% of the reason they could do it so fast was because of what they were receiving from their, spies in the West. So, really, the book is who the guy was. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So I
would like to have interviewed him, by the way, Zach. Oh, how I would like to have interviewed him.
Yeah, there's a note in there that he had someone approach him about a biography at some point.
Yeah, that's who I was talking about, a former colleague from Oak Ridge. Yeah, and they had a great exchange for several years, first in letters and then email. And actually in the book, in the photographs, you can see the inscription of that gentleman on a book that he sent to Koval in the 1990s. So there are a lot of important lessons in this book, but anyhow, let's get on with the writerly questions. Yeah.
Sure. So we had a good writerly question in the chat that I want to start with here, which is, as creative nonfiction writing, what is the ratio between the creative and factual parts in your writing? And that was a question I also had. So how do you balance the facts with being creative and telling a story?
Well, it has to be totally factual. And I think that's the attraction of narrative nonfiction, is that nothing can be made up, nothing. And so that's what is attractive in terms of the challenge. Also, every time I finish one of these books, I think, oh, I don't know if I can do this again, because the fact checking, you spend about 6 months on the fact checking and the source notes. You read these source notes, it's just amazing the amount of work that has to go into them. But also those facts, even descriptions, like in the book, I don't know what page it's on, but there's a description of Koval's handler. I didn't have that in the book, and my editor said, you have to describe what this guy looked like. What did he feel like? What did he look like, for the reader? And I said, that's not possible. It was hard enough finding out who he was. There's no physical description. So what I did was more research, found out he had graduated from Ohio Northern University in 1912, got his the yearbook, so I could see what he looked like, then read through, the 2,700 pages or whatever it is of FBI files, reports on the guy, all the interviews of what it was like to work with him, blah, blah, blah. And then I wrote the single paragraph. Well, the research that went into that single paragraph, which is in here somewhere, is amazing, because it really, that's about 2 months of research for one paragraph. So that is, what can turn off some people to narrative nonfiction. But the difference, the creativity is in the story structure. That's where the creative art is, how you put all these facts together. But you can't make up anything. No, that's against the rules. No, you can't, because then you're not doing narrative nonfiction. And really, it's not, it takes a lot of fun out of the, well, I would say, challenge out of, here, I can read you that paragraph. We don't have time. Do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
This paragraph, I would say, probably took two months of research just to put this together, to satisfy my wonderful dear editor. This is the 4th book I've done with the same editor. We work very well together, but he is very demanding, and that's good. With his rimless glasses and expressionless face, Lassen, a man of medium height, about 5'7", seemed quite ordinary. His thin brown hair showed specks of gray at an early age. That's from a passport photo I found in the FBI files. And by the time Koval met him, the graying around the temples was a solid feature. another photo from the FBI files, as was the diamond stick pin he always wore on his tie or lapel from interviews in the files. What made him blend into a gathering of strangers and yet stand out among acquaintances was the fact that he rarely smiled. By most accounts, he exuded an aura of skepticism and caution. A former colleague would describe Lassen as very private and discreet, a man with whom few wanted to spend time due to some unknown fear of him. Maybe it was just his silence. He looked hard at people, said so little. All from FBI files, you know. Yeah. So, I mean, so that does, I fulfilled my editor's assignment by finding that, but that's a very example. I mean, you can't, if you move across that border into making things up, then you're doing historical fiction. You're not doing narrative nonfiction. And, you know, my roots are at the Wall Street Journal. And man, in those days, what we had to go through to be sure every single line was accurate is amazing. And so that's sort of built in to also built in is a desire after the completion of one of these books to go spend a year or two writing a novel. But then I always find some topic that I fear will fall through the cracks. And so then I, you know.
That's really fascinating too.
Yeah.
The idea of the invisible work that goes into something that no one's ever going to see or know,
Right.
appreciate unless you
Yeah.
get a chance like this to mention it.
Right.
I recall I worked in television for a long time, and I remember sitting with a sportscaster named Chris Clark, and we spent like 3 hours on 20 frames of video, which is literally 2/3 of a second.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
no
it's
one will ever know
mind-boggling.
except me and him.
Oh yeah. Or it's like part one of this book. It was twice as long as it is now. Because again, my editor said, Ann, I know you love this. This is fascinating history and the background of George's childhood and his parents and the Russian pogroms and this and that. But you got to cut it in half. So I didn't cut it in half. I trimmed it in half. But yeah, but you know, there's just a lot, you know, in backstage that happens with productions like this, but you have to love it. You know, I mentor a lot of young writers. Well, you usually like 2 or 3 at once, but you know, that's what I tell them. You know, it's not the simplest thing in the world, and you have to love it, and you have to love the process of improving all the time, which happens. Which is why in the past I've always taught it as an adjunct, a course in writing somewhere, you know, between books, because there's always something new that I learn. But I mean, it's fascinating. But if you changed it so that you could make things up, it's sort of then you can't, like the descriptions of George in the prologue were from huge numbers of interviews with the woman who's in that in the FBI files. You know, I mean, she was interviewed endlessly, I think in 1956. And so, you know, so you have to learn how to find the stuff, then cull it, you know, gather it, then sift out what you can use that will push the story along. Yeah, I don't know.
So another question from the chat. As you describe it, the structure seems quote unquote natural. Did you consider other structures before the 3-act structure with intro and prologue and epilogue?
That's a great question. Yeah. And yes, the answer is yes. I get a sketch pad, and you know, the process is gather and sift, gather the information, and never let the research get away from you. And at some point you start sketching out story structures. It just almost happens naturally. And yes, I had different ideas. I always do. And that's the fun part. And I always get a sketchbook and then play with it, you know, play with the components and of the story, the great details, greatest scenes. You want every chapter to have to be, alluring. You want the end of every chapter to be alluring. So you have to sort of keep a file in your computer of some of the best scenes and some of the, the greatest details, even the greatest quotes, or the most, there were a lot of individuals in this. And so you have to sift out which individuals you're really going to focus on, that kind of stuff. So as you're doing that, the story structure, you have to keep that sketchbook with you, because the story structure, different ideas pop up as you're doing that, like in the first 6 or 7 months of the research. And then once you figure out, like, this story structure is the same as I used with Wild Ride, the first book, starting at this dynamic point, going back in time, going forward, returning to the dynamic point, and then showing the impact of whatever was dynamic, right? That is very classic. Let's see, a movie that does that, Goodfellas would be a movie that does that, starting at the Kennedy airport. I think it starts at the airport, stuffing the bodies in the trunk of a car, yada, yada, yada. Then it goes back in time, the life of Henry Hill, moving forward to the point where you understand the drama of that scene at the airport. And then it goes later, and then it moves on to the impact of that moment, so that's a good movie to watch for understanding that particular structure. But there are, it's just like Don Moffat wanted his reporters to understand every topic, has a different structure that will capture it, and so I think that it's not always, I've used this structure twice, Wild Ride and this book, but other books it hasn't worked for at all. The biggest challenge for me structure-wise was telling the biography of the year 1919. And that's a conversation for another time, but I think it works. But that was really hard to figure out. But to me, it's, like I said, it's sort of the core of the art of nonfiction, this creative, how do you organize these facts? You can't create details, but you can create the way you deliver the facts. Yeah.
So we have a publishing side of things question from the chat, and I may add a little to it too. So how did you go about finding an agent, and did you choose one specialized in narrative nonfiction? And also, since this is, I think we said this is book 6 or book 7? 6. Obviously, do you have the same agent that you had when you started, or have you gone through agents over the course of your?
No, I've always had
Good.
Same agent. Yeah, we get along really well, and same editor, same publisher for the previous past 4 books. And so the question is, how do you find one, or how
did you find yours?
Oh, mine. Yes. Well, specifically, I met her at an art gallery opening in Manhattan. And actually, it was her sister is a sculptress, and I went to the opening of one of her events, and I met my agent, and we had lunch. And I don't know, weeks later, maybe months later, I don't know, and we just worked well together. And at that point at the Wall Street Journal, we were kind of being encouraged, to advance our skills. And one way to do that was definitely writing books. And so anyhow, so Alice and I have always seen yeah, I mean, we don't always agree on everything, just like I don't always agree with my editor on everything, but we, in all those relationships, we have the ability to put the ego in the deep freeze and think that the project and the topic is the goal, make it the very best you possibly can. And I think that's why she and I have been together for so long. I mean, I could tell that I tell a story about Alice and me and brainstorming at lunch once in the acknowledgements of Beyond the River, I think it is. But anyhow, so yeah, it was kind of funny, but yeah, she's a great agent, but yeah, so I've had Alice for many, many, many years.
Great, great. I'm going to add, though, to my list of how to find an agent, go to art openings is my new method for finding agents.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah.
Not for everybody, but once in a while that does work.
Yeah.
So I have another question, and I actually like the last part of this question a lot from the chat. So with regard to the fact checks and source checking, is that being done by the publisher or assistants that you have hired, or by you? And were there any glaring errors that were discovered before the book was published? Was there any big error discovered during fact checking?
Oh, there always is. That's why they send out uncorrected proofs, Yeah, there always is. And I'm obsessed with that. So there always are. And that's very hard for me to get used to, because I work so hard to make it all accurate. And then, there's something happens, when the uncorrected proof comes, but then there's always the opportunity to change it. And that's what's really great. And so the question was just what
who's involved in the fact checking?
Well, I'm kind of obsessed with it. So and in this, so I do a lot of it, but I always bring specialists in, like this time a nuclear physicist, and I have a research assistant, spend a lot of time with the source notes. And then I had a Russian translator. So she and I had to do a lot of fact checking. So I would send sheets of questions to Masha, the translator, to be sure that X, Y, and Z was correct, because there are a lot of domains, background domains in this book, like the history of the Soviet atomic bomb project. So and a lot of Russian translations in it. So the Russian translator, the research assistant, me, and then my editor, my editor's assistant, and then the copy editor at the publishing house. So it is a team effort. And once again, the way that team can really work is when everybody puts their egos in the deep freeze, so, okay, so there's a big typo or something. So, okay, doesn't matter who did it, let's just correct it, Or, there's been a problem confusing plutonium with polonium throughout a lot of parts of secondary sources. And so I wanted to be sure that that was really nailed down. And so there's more stuff in the source notes than usual. That was, and then I had the nuclear physicist I brought on board, but so it is a group effort. I think a lot of people think that it's the job of the publisher to do the fact checking, but that's not really fair, because to the publisher, because the author is the one who's been living with this for years, So, but it's I could think of a couple examples of things the copy editor caught that I didn't see. And so, that's just the way it is with a piece of writing, and I feel very fortunate, because my team this time, they were just excellent, and the team at S&S. And then I just, and there was an error. There was an error, and I kept thinking, there's an error somewhere in this book. It's going to drive me batty. I can't find any errors. And so, as everyone in my life said, there's always an error in the book. In a book, you can't avoid that. And there was an error, and we found it, and we just corrected it a couple weeks ago. And it was in the background of the history of nuclear physics, and it wasn't really an error, it was an omission. I had omitted this female physicist who was responsible for fission. And so in 1939. And so now we've added that. But I think that was the error that was bugging me. And some wonderful reviewer, she gave a raving review on the book, and then she stuck that in. And I think, like one friend of mine said, most authors would have gone, how could she do that? I was so happy to find out what that was, because it was bugging me that something wasn't right here. And it wasn't anything that any fact checker could have caught, because it was something that was omitted, right? So, boy.
Yeah. Well, it looks like we're near the end here, and you said you had one little bit that you might want to read to us. So if you want
no, I want to be sure there are no questions, and that you don't have any more questions. Yeah,
I'm good. There was one more question in the chat then we can go to, and it's okay. Another kind of practical question. Someone just saw Red Joan, which is based on a somewhat similar topic. Do you have any screenplay movie deal in the works for Sleeper Agent?
Oh gosh, not that I know of, but if you know somebody, send it to them. That kind of thing takes a while, and hopefully it's being considered somewhere, but I don't know of any at the moment, but let's get it going. Yeah, I mean, it really is very cinematic, and and also it has some very relevant themes in it. I mean, it does show, well, anyhow.
Well, I mean,
very relevant themes. Yeah.
They are comping it in your jacket copy to the American. So you have a video project, which they already can sell it as similar to. So it's this.
Well, yeah, 3 people have emailed me in the last couple of weeks saying it's the perfect prequel, because it shows all about Soviet intelligence from the 1920s through the 30s and the 40s. And it shows the early setups for sleeper agents. One of the things the book shows is how students were sent to MIT and Columbia to study physics and chemistry. They were sent from the Soviet Union, and they were trained as spies, and they were sent to be science students. So there are a lot of great little details in that book. Anyhow, she says, modestly. Yeah, no, I mean it modestly. I will just tell you that writers like me will welcome the age of clones, because most writers are kind of introverts anyhow, right? So the writer can be working on the next book while the clone's doing presentations and promoting the book. But with the Writers Center, I feel completely comfortable and at ease, because I know I'm with fellow writers and people who understand not only the process, but the challenge of the process, Yeah. Well, which was one thing. So instead of reading more in the book, I did have a great section, but I wanted to introduce and for the audience, this wonderful book that was published in the 1930s. Can you see it? It's Dorothea Brand. And that sort of goes with your question about the story structure, and do you have the same one, and when you're doing the gathering and sifting of research, you need to keep close track of your research. You can't let it get away from you. And Dorothea Brand, because keep close track of it, because if you do, then within your subconscious, you will sort of build a subconscious understanding of the topic. And she talks about that in this book that was discovered by John Gardner. And actually, he discovered it in DuPont Circle years ago in the 1980s. John Gardner, does everybody know John Gardner? Sunlight Dialogues, wrote a fabulous book on writing, The Art of Fiction, I think. But at any rate, he fell in love with this book because it talks about the subconscious and the power of the subconscious in writing. And so mine, obviously, I've had it for years. It's falling apart. But he had it reprinted. It was a 1930s book, and he discovered it at a bookstore on DuPont Circle. He loved it, and he had it rewritten. He had it republished with a foreword written by him. And so I advise everybody to read this book, Becoming a Writer, because there's a lot of good advice in there about research, story structure, and for fiction and nonfiction.
All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time today. So Anne, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and to everyone here, please buy a copy of Sleeper Agent. It really is great. I mean, I think our talk today did justice to the amount of intrigue that is behind the research that went into this book. So hopefully people are intrigued and will go pick up a copy as well. So Anne, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Mark. It's great to have known you for the last, 75 years have we known each other? Yeah, no, long time. And so thank you very much. Thanks, Zach and Amy and the whole Writers Center. What a great organization you have built. It's fabulous. And thanks for having me.